This chapter, chapter 9, is over language in students with autism spectrum disorder. And so, if you recall, my current full time job is as an autism resource specialist, doing lots of professional development and consulting around individuals, children in the public school system with autism. And autism is, as you've discovered, with many of these other disabilities, closely related to a language deficit. And so, for many reasons, this topic is one I'm extremely passionate about. Excited to talk to you about this chapter. Also, just there is an increasing prevalence of individuals being diagnosed with autism, and we're going to talk about that a little bit as to why that is. Um, but I have no doubt, I can speak with 100% certainty that you will have individuals that you teach that will have this disorder. So, it's an important topic for everyone. I believe the most current CDC released, it was last April of 2020. I believe the prevalence is now 1 in 54. So that's pretty high prevalence rate. Here are your chapter goals, defining autism and what the major characteristics are. Describe the language and literacy components of ASD, and then some intervention approaches. Some key terms here for you to come back and review. We're going to start first with this broad definition, just trying to get a hold of what autism really is, what we know about it, what we know, if anything, about what causes it. Autism is very unique because the way that you qualify someone for it is all observational and behavioral. I mean, there are some standardized tests that are used, but there are none that are accepted as like the only eligibility criteria. So it's just very different disorder. It's a very different beast. It's a complex developmental disability that is characterized by significant problems with social interaction and communication, and by restricted, repetitive patterns of behaviors, interests, or activities. In the state of Missouri, the criteria would also include that we can separate it from an emotional disturbance. And then there's some suggested criteria, the supporting criteria of looking at sensory issues as well. But that's not technically in the definition. Now, the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, IDEA, that law we're always talking about that funds these services for kids in public schools, has this definition. Asperger syndrome also was eliminated in 2013, and it put autism spectrum disorder into one category with 3 levels, and that's why it's called spectrum. Requiring, and then they kind of put it in terms of how much support is needed. Requiring very substantial support, requiring substantial support, and just requiring support. This is different for a lot of reasons. Even when I was in school, I guess I'm dating myself. I graduated in 2010, and I learned terms like PDD-NOS, Asperger syndrome, autism, like Rett syndrome. They were kind of all on this, maybe still some kind of a continuum, but they had their own diagnosis. And they've really moved away from that. And they've also moved away from saying high functioning or low functioning autism. We want to say we're going to define their autism by how much support is needed for them to be successful. So some characteristics of autism, again, those impairments in their social skills, impairments in language, especially language for communicative acts, meaning they have to be able to take turns and respond appropriately. They have stereotyped or repetitive motor movements or in how they use an object. They really need sameness and routine. They can't cope without that. They typically have very highly restricted interests. And then they have that hyper or hypo reactivity to sensory. So they're either pretty tactily defensive or they're very much seeking tactile input. Causes. At this point, we do not know what causes ASD. We're going to talk about this a little bit. This is a hot topic for a lot of reasons. One of it's like why we want to know the cause because there's such a high prevalence. So anything that's a major concern gets more research. I mean, even just think of it in relation to COVID. Nobody was researching cures for this strand of virus until it was like everywhere. And we're like, we got to do something about this. It's affecting so many people. Autism is kind of the same way. You know, my parents were educators in the 80s and they talk about, well, yeah, we know this kid had autism now, it just didn't have a name. So as autism is understood, as it is more prevalently diagnosed, then all this research is following about what can actually cause this. You know, back in like the 60s, the earliest theories focused on the family and said that the family interaction was the cause. They actually had this term called refrigerator mothers, where they talked about it was actually like the mother's parenting style that would cause this. You know, current research is totally pointing away from that. It's not just nurture, it's very much nature. It's pointing toward biological reasons. You pick up a paper anymore. It doesn't even have to be a a publication from a special ed researcher. I'm just saying, like, you could pick up the New York Times. You're gonna see articles pretty regularly about we think we found this genome that's connected to autism spectrum. So there's a lot of research focused in that area, but we very much reject this theory that it's caused solely on family interaction. Just like any child born with a neurotypical brain or a neurodiverse brain, nurture has something to do with it. We know that. But it's not all of it. And we just want to make sure we remove that stigma because I cannot imagine as a parent, as a mom, being told you did this and you're watching your child maybe struggle with severe behaviors and you're thinking, what have I done? And we just want to remove that totally because that's not the sole source. That has not been proven. Some recent review of the research that is out there on the causes of ASD, like I said, genetic or chromosomal. There's been research if it's from the central nervous system, like it's a disorder of the central nervous system. And then, of course, the big one, I think most of you may have heard this, is that it comes from vaccinations. This is a video I want you to watch about what their research, what they've collected about what causes autism. And then we're going to come back and talk a little bit more about this idea of if vaccination causes it, because that's a very prevalent theory and rumor.